Hello, I'm Jan Szrewiński. Welcome on board the Eastern Express, and as always, I hope you enjoy the journey. Many were hoping that Russia's war against Ukraine was going to reveal the fragility of Vladimir Putin's system, its economic limits, its political fractures, and the strains of governing a vast, diverse and increasingly militarized state. And instead, the country has absorbed 24,000 sanctions, reorganized its economy, mobilized regional resources, and maintained elite cohesion without a single case of regional defiance. Moscow appears more durable than many expected, but that durability has a structure, and understanding it is essential to understanding the war. On this episode, we'll break down why Russia's political system has proven so resilient, not because it is strong in the conventional sense, but because it is flexible in ways that outsiders often overlook. So without further ado, let's take a look at our latest report to find out more.
When Western sanctions hit Russia in early 2022, the expectation was swift economic collapse. Instead, 4 years into the war, the Russian economy is still moving, slow and more strained, but far from paralyzed. Growth returned after a shallow recession, powered not by consumers or innovation, but by war spending and state-directed credit. Russia's GDP shrank by just 1.4% in 2022, then rebounded strongly in 2023 and 2024 as defense orders surged and factories ran hot. By 2025, that momentum faded. Lower oil prices, capacity limits, and tight labor market began to bite. Unemployment fell to historic lows, not because of a boom, but because workers are becoming scarce. The pressure shows up in prices and in the currency. Inflation spiked twice during the war, and each wave came with currency weakness. The central bank raised rates, but inflation remains stubborn, a sign that parts of the wartime economy no longer respond to normal monetary breaks. Russia's fiscal picture still looks manageable, but it has been reshaped. Spending rose, deficit became routine, and defense took a larger bite of the federal budget, squeezing social policy and other civilian lines. At the same time, the state leaned more on non-oil taxes and prepared further hikes. To fund the gap, Moscow burned through liquid savings in the National Wealth Fund and relied more heavily on domestic borrowing, much of it absorbed by Russian banks. And beyond the budget, the war economy runs on shadow plumbing, state-directed credit and quasi-fiscal support that keeps defense-linked production moving while storing up risks for later. The bottom line is blunt. Sanctions did not stop the war machine quickly. Russia adapted, rerouted trade and managed the shock. But the resilience has limits. With labor shortages, inflation pressure, depleted liquid reserves and long-term isolation from Western technology and markets, stagnation may be the least pessimistic outcome. An economy can bend for years. It rarely bends forever.
And now let's zone in on the explaining portion of our show. Russia is now the most sanctioned country globally by number of restrictions imposed. But that does not automatically mean that it's the most isolated. Here is how Russia's sanctions burden compares with long-term restrictions targets like Iran and North Korea.
Since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, Russia has faced more than 16,000 sanctions, mainly from Western states. They target banks, energy, transport, technology and individuals. Yet Russia still exports oil and gas and trades widely through China, India, Turkey, the Gulf states, cushioning the economic impact of the restrictions. Iran has lived under heavy sanctions for decades, especially over its nuclear program. Restrictions sharply limited oil exports, access to finance and foreign investment. Over time, Iran adapted through smuggling and regional trade, but its economy remains weakened, with high inflation and long-term stagnation. North Korea is under near-total international sanctions covering trade, fuel, arms and finance. But because its economy was never integrated into global markets, sanctions have limited leverage. The regime survives largely through Chinese support and illicit networks. Russia faces the broadest sanctions regime ever imposed, but not the harshest in structural terms. Iran shows how economies adapt under long pressure, while North Korea shows how the impact of isolation can ultimately peter out. For Russia, sanctions are designed to weaken the state over time rather than to trigger immediate collapse.
And now, as always, let's take a look at the issue in greater detail. Why has Russia, under unprecedented sanctions, international isolation, and the pressures of a long war, remained so resilient? The answer begins with a simple truth. Russia is not governed solely through the rigid vertical of power, often referenced by analysts. While the Kremlin retains absolute political control, it delegates extensive operational authority to regional and local governments. This delegation is not a concession, but a design choice that gives the system its flexibility in moments of crisis. When Russia launched its full-scale invasion of Ukraine, many observers predicted rapid economic shock and political destabilization. Yet the expected collapse did not come. Instead, Russian companies rerouted trade toward China, India, and the broader global south. Energy exports became the backbone of new partnerships, and logistical chains adapted with remarkable speed. This economic agility is important, but it is not central. To understand that resilience, we must consider Russia's size and its diversity. The Russian Federation spans nearly 6.6 million square miles, encompassing dozens of ethnicities, cultures, and histories. Geography alone would seem to undermine the Kremlin's ability to maintain cohesion during wartime. Regions are unequal, often impoverished, and historically prone to tension. Yet the loyalty of every governor, without exception, has held. Not one regional administration has challenged Moscow's authority. This loyalty is essential here. Decisions are made in the Kremlin, but the regions do the fighting, so to say. They supply manpower, manage mobilization, oversee military support networks, and administer the social infrastructure required to sustain a long war. So how does Moscow secure such unwavering loyalty, you may ask? They must deliver political stability, but beyond these requirements, they enjoy significant autonomy. The presidential administration monitors only deviations from expected behavior. It does not attempt to micromanage the vast machinery of regional governance. Now, this system is reinforced by an expanding set of metrics used to evaluate governors. The most important is the level of trust in authorities, which includes protest activity and youth attitudes towards patriotism. Other indicators cover economic growth, infrastructure, and social services. Now, these are monitored at the federal level, but compliance is flexible. Partial underperformance rarely triggers immediate dismissal. Yet the autonomy given to governors comes with a permanent threat: criminal prosecution. Since the full-scale invasion began, legal action against regional and federal officials has increased dramatically. Governors understand the boundaries. Their autonomy exists inside what one analyst called a spacious cage, large enough for managerial freedom, but small enough to guarantee obedience. So, could this model break down? Some analysts argue that regional discontent could eventually rise to challenge Moscow. But there is little evidence for this today. Governors benefit from the existing system, you see. They have no incentive to destabilize it, and every incentive to preserve it. It is a system built for survival, and in wartime, so far, it has delivered. And now, here to shed more light on the issue is Vera Konstantinova, former foreign policy advisor to the chairman of the Ukrainian parliament. Hello and welcome to Eastern Express.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Good day.
So how would you rate the resilience of the Russian economy in the face of sanctions?
We should begin with the understanding that despite all negative impact that sanctions do really have on the Russian economy, we still observe its resilience. That's definitely the issue. But I would say that sanctions regime reduces significantly reduces the access of Russian economy to Western finance as well as technology. So from one side, we do see the resilience of Russian economy in short run. But according to my understanding, in long run, it wouldn't be so effective. And according to my understanding, I would like to underline, I would say, three key pillars of Russian resilience. First of all, it's definitely a war-style life and economy that Russia had introduced since February 2022. And as I have already mentioned, I believe within the live stream of TVP World that Russia created the circumstances for business, for doing business using the war. So in terms of resilience, that's the first issue. I mean, in terms of social resilience. And the second one, it should be mentioned like energy flows, energy revenues. So we still, despite all decisions had been already taken by our European partners, we still observe the Russian energy flows into Europe and vice versa. So in terms of understanding their resilience, energy revenues is still in the table. But at the same time, the third point, I would say that it's a command and control toolkit that Russia as the economy, at the government, at the management still has, because Russia is the authoritarian regime. So despite all pressure that had already put on the Russian economy, we still observe the high level of decision-making in terms of inflation risks reduction, in terms of involvement of hard currency into Russian economy. So maybe that's the issue.
So the three pillars. Now, do these three pillars have any weak points? Because if you're a country in the West which has a genuine intention of slowing down the Russian war machine, like, I mean, we still don't have the consensus in the West, unfortunately, and much depends on the peace talks. Nevertheless, as an overall phenomenon, we're looking at these three pillars. Which of them is the most likely to crumble if, of course, proper stimuli are applied to it?
Again, according to my understanding, I believe that energy is the key for everything. But if to step down and look through the latest updates of the Russian economic inflation rates or regarding the exchange rates, we should understand that we need to unite efforts in terms of Ukrainian partners, in terms of European partners, in order to fix the gaps exists still within the economic sanctions regimes imposed on Russia. So my key point that despite all efforts, we still see countries, third countries, that continue to help Russia with revenues, energy revenues, first of all, and continue to deal with Russian business. And that's the main point, for, according to my understanding. But at the same time, we need to understand also that because of high level of adaptation, Kremlin was ready for the consequences of its aggression. It's important to understand that Kremlin created a lot of networks of fleet, for example, of the experience that they have with, for example, Iranian partners. That's why it's important to unite efforts all around the globe, not only within the European or transatlantic community.
Would that even be possible, though? I mean, if secondary sanctions are applied by the US administration, I mean, we've already seen that US sanctions can be pretty effective, looking at how Lukoil and Rosneft are doing right now and how they used to be before the sanctions went into effect. But now secondary sanctions against the likes of India and China, because these are the biggest recipients of Russian hydrocarbons now, that would be a bit more tricky. So if these sanctions are not there, are there any other pressure points that can be applied? Because that will obviously take time before these massive sanctions, before they enter into force.
I believe that we need to have negotiations, despite, sanctions is also a tool, but diplomacy should work as well. In terms of understanding how to create circumstances when the Russian Federation as an aggressor would decide to stop this war, I believe that it's a common challenge and a common task. It's not a task only for transatlantic community or for Donald Trump administration. It's important also to realize that we need partners not only in Asia, but also in Africa, but also in Latin America. So according to my point of view, according to my understanding, there are several issues and several options. Of course, there are a lot of concerns that we heard from our European partners regarding the further development in terms of peace deal, as you have already mentioned. But we need to also to promote the idea that despite all tools, we also have the opportunity to communicate, to negotiate with other countries around the globe and to understand what kind of concerns they already have. There are a lot of problems devoted to the involvement of manpower of third countries on the Russian side. So maybe that could be a tipping point or a starting point for any negotiations in order to pressure using the diplomatic tools of other countries to pressure on Russia and to pressure on the Kremlin.
But that seems like a task for the long term, right? I mean, that would also mean that Western countries would need to improve their relations with the global South. Sometimes these relations are being dragged down by the decades of colonialism and this sort of, resentment that still lingers there. Now, before that happens, let's take a look at the other pillar, namely the war economy. Would you agree that this is, of course, from the Russian side, a significant success? They've managed to transform their economy to function like that. But can this actually be successful indefinitely? Are there any signs that this might be leading to more problems than it is worth for the Russians? And that, 2026 could still be viable. But beyond that, perhaps not necessarily.
I have already begun with the idea that in long-term run, Russian economy under the pressure of war, under the pressure of sanctions, would collapse. But the idea, the main key, I would say, in this regard, should be mentioned in terms of understanding the revenues of Russian budget from one side, and from other side, the ability to mobilize the economy. That's the key point I would make, because of due to the preparations had been made by Russian leadership before the Great War of 2022. They created already a lot of networks, a lot of shadow networks, in order to have some kind of resilience due to Western sanctions. But from other side, as we have already mentioned, the global South could be the contributor to the global stability, because the Ukrainian issue, it's not the issue between US or Russia or the global powers, how to say. It's the global issue of international law. That's the main idea in terms of negotiating with other countries. So in terms of resilience and understanding whether Russian economy would have or wouldn't have any problems in 2026, I would say that due to the latest updates and economic estimations, we have significant reduction of revenues come to Russia in terms of energy flows.
No, of course, I mean, that's the external side. We are running out of time, and I would like to ask you about the internal side. Briefly, do you think that issues such as, compensation for troops who go to the front lines and never come back, these actually have alleviated the poverty in some of Russia's most impoverished regions? There is, of course, the incentives for the arms industry and all this. Would this, in the long run, lead to the economy becoming overheated if it's still, applied in the same way as it is now?
As I have already mentioned, Russian leadership had created a business using this war. So in terms of social component and social domain, there is no option right now to stop this war from Russian perspective, because they would need to accumulate many soldiers from the front line in their economy. But their economy is still within the war domain. So maybe the idea that we need to pressure more until the end of 2026, when the Russian leadership would make a decision that this war is uncreatable for them and destructive for them. So maybe the idea in this. But again, social component is very important to understand that this war is not the war of Putin. It's war of Russian nation.
And that is a sobering assessment concerning the immediate future of this conflict. Vera Konstantinova was our guest today here on TVP World. Thank you very much for joining us and for sharing your insight. And now we move on to the Eastern News Flash, a series of all the other stories from the East that you absolutely don't want to miss. NATO will open a second coordination and transit hub for military aid to Ukraine in Romania in January 2026, aiming to reduce reliance on the main logistics gateway in Poland.
The new site will operate alongside the existing hub in Rzeszów, Poland, under NATO security assistance and training for Ukraine mission. NATO officials say spreading the load lowers risk if a single route is disrupted and gives allies a stronger logistics backbone along the eastern flank. They also mentioned the mission moved around 220,000 tons of military assistance in 2025, using thousands of truck and rail shipments and hundreds of strategic airlift flights. The Romanian hub is expected to be operational by the end of January and provide a southern transit route supporting deliveries including air defense and artillery systems.
India has confirmed that more than 200 of its nationals have been recruited into the Russian army since the start of the war against Ukraine, with dozens already killed or missing.
India's foreign ministry said in a recent report that 202 Indian citizens are believed to have been recruited by Russia since 2022. According to the ministry, 26 have been killed and 7 are missing, while 119 have been discharged following diplomatic efforts. 50 Indian nationals remain in the Russian armed forces, with New Delhi saying it is in continuous contact with Moscow to secure their release and repatriation. The ministry also confirmed that the bodies of 10 Indians have been returned home, while 2 were cremated locally, with DNA samples from families sent to Russia to help identify remains. The disclosure adds to growing evidence that Moscow is recruiting foreign nationals through financial incentives and misleading job offers, alongside promises of Russian citizenship, as it seeks to sustain its war effort against Ukraine.
And for this episode of Eastern Express, it's the end of the line. Please stay with us here on TVP World for more latest news and updates.